I'm going to talk a little bit about horror films. This is inspired by um, the Tennessee Screenwriting Association's Short and Scary script contest. And also, this is the time of the year where everybody starts throwing pumpkins and ghosts and things outside. So it's probably appropriate. Um, I'm going to talk about short horror films and feature length horror films, even though they are both related, obviously, by genre. There's a few things that are often a little bit different between the two. Uh, so, for starters, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the general aspect of horror feature films. Horror feature films typically are uh, different from other types of feature films in that um, in the horror genre, the audience for horror movies is as interested or even more interested in what the story is about rather than who's in it and when does it take place or any of the other details. The concept is usually what grabs horror film audiences and inspires them to decide to watch something like that. So as long as you have a really cool idea, then you've got a leg up on getting your story out there to the world. In horror features, there's a little bit of difference also between the independent feature film realm and the Hollywood studio type of horror stuff. There's typically a lot more available in the independent realm for people to watch, partly because of what I talked about earlier. And then also that you can, as long as you have a good concept, it's not too expensive to shoot horror films on an independent dime. The other thing about the horror film is that it doesn't have to be all that original. Stephen King started his career basically by doing really terrific versions of horror ideas that already existed. So, Carrie is about a high school girl that has telekinesis. It's just his spin on it. Everybody already knew about telekinetic stuff. It already existed in the horror realm. When he did Salem's Lot, that's a vampire movie or vampire book, but it's just about a town getting inhabited and changed over into vampires. And he didn't invent that, he just told it very well. And independent filmmakers can do the same thing. If you can come up with an idea that's kind of new and original, you've got a good shot at really finding a place out there in the viewer realm. So yeah, so Stephen King really became pretty much the top selling writer, definitely top selling horror writer in the world by doing ideas that already existed. And in fact, the thing is even though a lot of people think that Hollywood is looking for unique story ideas, that's really a fallacy. They're really not. They're just looking for things that people are already familiar with, but with a fresh spin on them. I mean, Stephen King even duplicated himself when he did Firestarter, which was another version of the telekinetic thing. Instead, this time it was the pyrokinetic. But so when you're looking at horror movies on the independent level, which there are just so many of them, so many success stories, the other thing about them is that there's really only one purpose they have to serve, and that's to be scary. They don't even necessarily have to make sense. And that's in both the the studio realm and the independent realm. Although the studio people usually are typically uh, a little more hardcore about trying to make ideas make sense. Um, but the horror market demonstrates over and over again that that's not necessary, in part because horror uh, plays on the idea that the experience that the viewer is supposed to have, number one, above everything else, is some version of fear. Fear or dread is what horror films are all about, and forcing the viewer to wrestle with those ideas, at least for uh, hour and a half or 2 hours, uh, is really the main idea and the main goal. So as long as you accomplish that, you can do a Blair Witch Project type of story, which really doesn't make any sense at all. But it doesn't have to, because it apparently was scary enough for audiences that it was a huge hit, along with the huge marketing campaign that sort of presented it more as a Halloween haunted house experience, also. Um, but the idea is that there's a lot of movies that have come out recently in the past few years on the independent level that don't really make sense, but they don't have to. I know that they're working on a sequel to It Follows, and It Follows was a very successful, very effective independent horror film, and it sets the rules to the story, to the supernatural force early on, and then follows them all the way through. It doesn't explain why it's happening, where it comes from, why this force does what it does. It doesn't matter. It just has to be scary. Um, when The Grudge was adapted for U.S. audiences, The Grudge was a series of films and even a TV series in Japan, and was hugely successful. And when it was adapted for American audiences, uh, it when they released the film to critics to try to get some good critical responses, they were slammed. It was totally destroyed by the critics, and so the studios didn't know what they were going to do. And somebody had the brilliant idea to just put uh, video cameras in theaters where they were doing screenings of the movie, and they show people losing their crap when they're in the theaters. And people were coming out and they were interviewing them, and they were saying, "That's the scariest movie I've ever seen." And so when audiences went to see this movie, um, the rules of that movie are really kind of hinky. The logic is kind of hinky, but it doesn't matter because it's super scary, and it was a huge hit and created a series of sequels here too. So um, the thing about horror movies is that they can also follow a kind of a nightmare logic, and in nightmares, um, things often don't make sense, but they're still terrifying. And in part, they're terrifying because they don't make sense. And that's sort of an element that, if you do it correctly, it can really work well in a horror movie. So there's all these um, things that can go into the success of a horror movie that make it a little easier for independent filmmakers to really access it. The other thing about independent horror movies is that um, you can kind of break some rules and go outside of boundaries of storytelling that studio films typically are reluctant to do. And I'm sure everybody can think back about all the movies over movie history where Hollywood just put out a horror movie like The Exorcist that really goes outside the boundaries. But that was in the 70s, and they're a lot uh, less daring in Hollywood these days. The likelihood they'll make movies like that out of the studios, even the mid-level studios, are less and less at the moment. But um, they'll sure as heck distribute movies like that, and to great success. And some movies I don't think are all that good, but they hit a nerve for audiences, and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if I think they're good. Movies like X or Barbarian. Barbarian's interesting because it plays with storytelling. It shifts protagonists, somewhat similar to what Hitchcock did in Psycho. And it does it to good effect. I think that in some ways, the way the story is told is more interesting than the actual heart of what the story is about. But I think that's part of the idea behind these horror movies, is that if you come up with something that's very interesting, then you get a good shot at finding an audience. Um, the other interesting thing about horror movies is that um, there's a broad range of ways that you can do horror. So you can approach it with the shock factor, with jump scares and gore, and uh, just all kinds of dynamic stuff. And you can do that again on the independent level. You can go for all the slasher movie type stuff, or of course the granddaddy of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But horror also works with no gore budget, as long as the writing's good and you tap into the right type of fear. Then you can do a Rosemary's Baby, which I don't think has a single drop of blood in it, if I recall right. I may not, but anyhow, all it's about is the fear of other people manipulating you, and the lack of trust in society, and also about that fear of not being in control of your body and what's going on inside your body. So that's elemental, primal dread that people have. And when you tap into that, then you can get away with a lot of stuff. You don't even have to write a big, sterling, interesting backstory for all the characters. One of the most successful horror franchises there is, a big Hollywood horror franchise, is Alien. You know almost nothing about the main characters in that story. You don't know their backstories. In Alien in particular, the only backstory is that they work for a big mining corporation. So this spaceship goes around and collects resources for a company, and that's pretty much it. You get a bare bones backstory with a couple of the characters who are the workers that are talking about going on strike. So you see that they've been unhappy in the past. That's about it. So and having no backstory to understand the motivations of these characters, that didn't hurt that movie's success. And there's hardly any backstory in the following sequels. Probably the only real backstory we see is with the carryover character like Ripley, and we know her backstory in later movies. Her backstory is the previous movies, so you don't even really have to do a lot of deep diving like that when you develop a horror movie. Identification with the main characters is really sort of the main goal. And that identification can come from just having ordinary circumstances that everyone experiences, only in this case, the case of your story, things go horribly wrong, and they tap into the fears of the audience of being in that same situation and things going horribly wrong. Um, One of the most famous scenes in horror movie history is in Psycho, and it's about all it does is tap into the terror of how scary it would be to be trapped naked in your shower with somebody attacking you and trying to kill you. Another natural fear is in the movie Jaws. In the movie Jaws, uh, that opens with a shark attack, and being the prey of a giant predator when you're in the water, that taps into so many primal fears and primal ideas for humans that they really grab the audience right away. Typically, when you think of the opening of the movie, you usually want to try to signal that uh, a movie is a specific genre. So, in the case of a horror movie, most horror movies will start the movie off with a horrific scene. Um, in fact, in movie storytelling in general, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the story starts with a scene featuring either the antagonist or the protagonist. And in horror movies, it really tests that idea. So many of them start with the antagonist in the opening scene, in large part because that's how you demonstrate to the audience that, yes, in fact, this is a horror movie. A lot of times, on occasion, horror movies will start with the protagonist in ordinary circumstances, and it's in a weird way that's kind of a risky thing to do, but usually that's done to um, uh, humanize the protagonist a little bit more to the audience. But typically, they start like Jaws does, or like Scream does, with the phone call and the girl being stalked by the killer. Um, just movie after movie after movie, you can look at in the horror genre, and somebody's getting killed in the very opening scene. That's how The Ring starts, another series adapted from a very successful Japanese horror series. Um, and that starts by showing us the force of antagonism and the rules of the story. They're all or the rules of the antagonist are sort of presented to us in that moment. So that's something to consider when you're looking at developing your own horror script. If it's a short film, um, you probably want to try to get into your horror elements as quickly as possible. You don't get into the backstory of characters because you don't have the time. If you do, it's because that backstory relates very specifically to some element of the story. If you have a little bit more time, then you can take a look at that. But specifically, since we're kind of talking about this inspired by the contest short script thing, that's a 15-minute time limit. 15 pages equals 15 minutes, so that's the time limit. So you really need to hop pretty quickly into the story, and it's really doable if you watch enough horror short films and find the ones that are successful and study what they're doing. You realize how the real successful ones are very simple and elegant, and they just don't need as much as you might believe they do. You don't have to overthink it so much. One example I like to use is Lights Out, the short film. In Lights Out, uh, I think it's under 3 minutes, and it just starts in an ordinary circumstance with a woman standing in the hallway getting ready to go to bed, and she turns out the lights, and she thinks she sees something in the hallway. And that just taps into ordinary circumstances that we all experience. But what if something weird is going on in that experience? So they haven't explained anything. And when you watch that short, you realize that it goes from beginning to end. It doesn't explain the reasons why the thing is happening. And it doesn't need to, because it's a horror movie. It only needs to tap into a circumstance in such a way that we believe in our deepest, darkest recesses of our mind, we're afraid that it could happen. So the other interesting thing about Lights Out, and about horror movies or stories in general, is that you don't have to have a happy ending. You don't even have to have a clear ending. Um, not that your story will suffer if you do have a clear ending, and if it is a uh, studio horror movie, they'll probably force a happy ending on it, because that's just in their nature. 999 times out of 1,000. Every once in a while, they'll do a story that has a really downer ending, like Seven, but usually not. The thing to try to remember to do in horror movies, and there's variations of this in all movie types, but in horror movies especially, one thing, if you can do it, is to try to put in some sort of a twist or a surprise. Um, if you really think about it, a great example of this sort of thing is done by the classic TV series, The Twilight Zone. And the Twilight Zones are generally about 20 to 22 minutes. So they're all short films in essence. They're all self contained stories. Sometimes they end with happy endings, and very often they end with not so great endings, or they end with macabre endings that, for the type of story that it is, it's not an unhappy ending, but it's unsettling nonetheless. So uh, you can insert twists into your stories. Uh, it's a lot easier than people think that it is. And the idea for doing a twist is just to not give the audience all the information. Uh, in fact, in screenwriting is mostly screenwriting is about giving information out at the proper time. In that's in essence what you're doing. You're giving out information about characters, about the story, about their motivations, and what's driving them at the time that it will have the most impact. And so a twist in a story is just allowing the audience to believe one thing and then giving them information that shines the story in a different light, that shows that they've either been believing the wrong thing or that there's more to it. And so as long as you do that in a smooth way that doesn't seem like a big cheat, the audiences love that sort of stuff. And so if you can insert one in your story, it's going to make a big impact. If M. Night Shyamalan has built a career on being the twist guy, and that's for better or for worse. That's who he is, and he tried to work a twist in and all most of his stories. And it's been very successful for him. And if he can do it, you can do it too. So try to look at putting a twist in. If you could put 2 twists in, people will think you're a screenwriting brilliance of Einstein. A lot of times, the twist comes at the end, but it also comes early on sometimes. So, The Matrix was a film series that success was built on a big twist. And in the first movie of The Matrix, a lot of weird things are happening. And then the turn into Act Two reveals that the entire world isn't what you think it is. And in fact, the entire world is of humans is enslaved by machines, and that the reality that we're experiencing isn't what's really going on. You can have a huge impact on your audiences by putting a twist in. Um, it's an attention grabber early on, and if it's at the end, it'll make people often want to rewatch the movie just to see if you cheated, like in M. Night Shyamalan's first successful movie, The Sixth Sense. They even in that movie they even knew that you would question it, so they gave you a little clips from earlier in the story to justify all the uh, all the evidence that the protagonist is actually dead and a ghost himself in the story. And people went back to watch the movie again to see it from that point of view. You can do that in your features. You could also do it in your short films. Um, and just remember, for horror movies, all the tropes, all the pieces of the genre that make it what it is are things that you should include, but you can also play with those. These are all things you can pick up watching other movies, horror movies. Watch a lot of feature film horror movies. Watch a lot of short films. Uh, if you're planning really on pursuing a horror film, you're probably a fan anyway. And if you're not, then try to become a fan. If you're not a fan, you're probably not going to write a great horror film. Good luck in the contest if you choose to enter it, and if you get inspired to do a full length feature, then good luck in that as well. Oh, one quick other thing to mention too. If you do a successful horror short film, that can be a legitimate pathway to success. The short film for Lights Out was actually developed and turned into a feature film. I think technically it was more successful as a short film, but that doesn't matter to you, the writer. You still get feature film money in your pocket when it gets made. Another one to look at that's in that similar vein is Mama. That's a very short film. I think it's 3 minutes or less, and you can find it online as well. There's a version of it with an introduction by Guillermo del Toro, who was so impressed by that short film that he decided to develop it into a feature-length film as well. Study and learn your stuff about horror, and there's some really interesting pathways to success in that world. So best of luck to you.